Hello, everyone. This is Sandy Joy with Beneath the Silence, Healing the Wounds of Betrayal Trauma. I want to thank my listeners, those who have viewed the videos, and please, thank you. If you would share, subscribe to my YouTube channel, that would mean the world to me. Please leave a comment, or if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those questions. So today is episode 5, and today we're going to talk about complex trauma within betrayal trauma and how they go together. When I was doing my research and writing this episode, I realized there was a lot of information. And so I want to be able to share that information, but to keep the podcast, I'm hoping to keep it to the 30 minutes as much as possible. Um, I'm going to do it in two parts. So, because there is some information from Dr. Omar Minwala regarding the 13 dimensions of trauma that many people experience that contribute to the complex trauma. So today I'm going to talk about what the definitions of complex trauma are for children and then adults, and get into some just other avenues of that. And then in part 2, I'm going to talk about those 13 dimensions of trauma itself and how it relates to betrayal trauma across the board. Okay. So so thank you again for joining me today, and we'll get started. When betrayal isn't a one-time wound, okay, but part of a long pattern of harm, and that's what betrayal trauma is, a long pattern of harm, it can leave deeper scars than we realize. And this is where betrayal trauma and complex trauma intersect, where they meet. Okay. And for many survivors, those wounds are tightly woven together that separating them feels impossible. So today we're going to untangle that connection just so you can see your healing path a little more clearly. Because often our symptoms of complex trauma are disregarded, are ignored, not only potentially by ourselves, and that can be from, a from blindness, which is going to be episode 6, will be on betrayal trauma blindness. Okay. But it's also from our medical practitioners. And I also want to be very, very clear. This is information that I'm giving to you from research and Dr. Minwala, who is a psychologist. I am not a doctor. I cannot diagnose. I cannot tell you you have something. And remember also that betrayal trauma isn't a diagnosis. It's something that you experience, whereas complex trauma is a diagnosis. Okay. And so you can go to your primary care physician or psychologist to receive that diagnosis if you feel that that's a need for you. Okay. So what is complex trauma? So I'm going to start with what's complex trauma in children. Okay. So I'm going to read here just because I have some quotes. And this is from Dr. Arthur Beckman Weidman, as cited in Phoenix Fostering. And I'll have the link in the description of the podcast here. And he describes complex trauma in children as follows. And this is a quote. Okay. Complex trauma refers to both the exposure of children to traumatic events and the effects of this exposure on the development of children and their future lives as adults. Complex trauma refers to the experience or experiences in early childhood of severe, sustained, and developmentally detrimental traumatic experiences. These traumatic events are often experienced by the child within their closest attachment relationships, such as those with their primary caregivers, okay, and include physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, neglect, separation and loss, and witnessing domestic or community violence, right? Now, it doesn't have to be parents or aunts or uncles or grandparents. This could be teachers, coaches that they've had for a long time, babysitters, or other extended family members or family members of friends. Okay? Because anyone in their close circle, and a child's close circle is anyone they really know and they feel safe with or had felt safe with. Okay. The Child Traumatic Stress Network, and it's a work group. It is also cited in Phoenix Fostering. And again, I will have that link as well. They identify 7 domains of impairment in children exposed to complex trauma. So, when they're exposed to complex trauma, you can bet your bottom dollar that it's betrayal trauma. Okay? Not 100%, I can't say that, but a high 90% would be betrayal trauma. And these 7 domains are attachment, which is a future podcast future episode, we'll go dive more deeply into. Biology, affect, emotional affect. So that's regulation, emotion regulation. So difficulties with regulating emotions. Dissociation, behavioral control. So when we talked about symptoms, and I talked about in children, it's often those, bad behaviors that children have often are associated with betrayal trauma and complex trauma. Okay. Behavioral control, cognitive processing, and self-concept. And self-concept is how they view themselves, not only in their world, but view their reality and view their self-worth, which is usually very, very low. Okay. So all 7 components, so that's the end quote. Okay. So my words now, all 7 components of complex trauma speak to the impact of betrayal trauma for children and adults alike. And also in a study by Bessel van der Kolk, and this is also from Phoenix Fostering, okay, 2024. But Dr. van der Kolk, and this is a quote from him, states that a highly significant relationship between adverse childhood experiences, we call them ACEs, which again, I would argue that a high 90% of those are betrayal trauma. In adverse experiences, the children and then as adults experience depression, suicide attempts, alcoholism, drug abuse, sexual promiscuity, domestic violence, cigarette smoking, or we can say vaping now. This study from Bessel van der Kolk was 2005. So I just want to be very, very clear that vaping wasn't a thing 20 years ago. Okay. Obesity, physical inactivity, and sexually transmitted diseases, which we now call sexually transmitted infections. In addition, the more adverse childhood experiences reported, the more likely a person was to develop heart disease, cancer, have strokes, diabetes, skeletal fractures, so osteoporosis, um, um, and liver disease. Okay, end quote. Though he went on to suggest that people, and this is quote again for Dr. van der Kolk, people with childhood histories of trauma, abuse, and neglect make up almost the entire criminal justice population in the United States. Let's sit with that for a moment. That almost the entire criminal population or population in the criminal justice system in the United States have had childhood histories of trauma, abuse, and neglect, which is betrayal trauma. It's sad. They grow up, they don't know what to do with themselves, low self-worth, their reality is all skewed. We're going to talk about that in part 2 about ego fragmentation and reality fragmentation as a component of the dimensions that Dr. Minwalla talk about. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the definition of what complex trauma is in adults. Okay, so Dr. Omar Minwalla in 2021 defines complex trauma as something that differs from PTSD. Okay, complex trauma involves repeated patterns of harm where the survivor cannot escape. Okay, they cannot escape for whatever reason. It could be their self-worth is so low, they don't believe they deserve anything more. In betrayal trauma, we internalize that they believe it's their fault, that whatever's happening to them is happening, and they have to change and they have to do better. And that is what's causing them to stay because it's them. It could be the devil they know rather than the devil they don't. And that's part of betrayal trauma blindness, which again, I'll get in deeper. But it's not being able to be in the chaos, because being in the chaos to acknowledge that betrayal is happening of some sort is to acknowledge that we have to do some sort of action. And if they're not able to take some sort of action, like leave for whatever reason, gain, and it can be financial, it can be emotional, that they 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 have to stay. And that's the bottom line. So Dr. Minwalla, again, repeated patterns of harm where the survivor cannot escape. It shapes alternative ways of handling emotions. So often that's numbing, the alexithymia I mentioned before. Altering thought systems. So it's me, it has to be me that's doing this. And leading to distorted thinking and self-perception. I'm the bad person. I must be doing things wrong. There's the game and the guilt and shame. Complex trauma changes how a person perceives and responds to abuse, hinders learning and relationships, and creates a distorted sense of self in the world, just like with children, distorted thinking, self-perception. And again, it's taking the blame, that internalization, and it's what's wrong with me. Okay, that's end quote. So the main difference then with PTSD and complex trauma is the repeated pattern of harm in which the survivor has a difficult time escaping, whereas PTSD is a single event trauma. I'm not minimizing PTSD at all. It is hell. It's that complex trauma is on a completely different level. It's multiply that hell by at least 10. And that's just a number out of my head. I didn't do the if there's been research on the number of the difference, it's just a different level. Okay. Over time, and with these repeated patterns of harm, the survivor questions whether they're going crazy or not, often think in betrayal trauma, we're going crazy, and it alters their thought systems. Okay. They develop distorted thinking, and the thoughts about themselves begin to diminish to a greater extent. And that greater extent is that low self-worth. And when our self-worth is in the gutter, we're not able to make decisions that are in our best interest. We focus fully on the other person, often the perpetrator, and what they need. rather than what we need and what's safe for us, because there's no safety anywhere, not even in our own body. Okay. So Dr. Manwala goes on to talk about complex trauma shaping and why this is important is that in complex trauma shaping, what he says, trauma shaping exists when the partner may not be aware. Now, remember that Dr. Minwala began the Institute of Sexual Health. His specialty is betrayal trauma around um, deceptive sexual behavior, and so sex and porn addiction, or you know, but no, this is relatable to all forms of addictions that perpetrators may have or abuse that the survivor may have. Okay. Um, so grooming, deception, so lying, including lying by omission, manipulation, gaslighting, blaming the survivor. So think Darvo, deny that they've done anything wrong, accuse the survivor that it's their fault, or that they're the problem. And the list is endless, and it occurs regardless of the type of abuse. Okay. So, well, Dr. Manwala, I said, is an expert in deceptive sexual or sexuality, trauma such as porn and sex addiction. The aspects of betrayal trauma and complex trauma intersect across the board. That's the reason I shared Dr. Minwala's work. And that's why I'll share it in part two, because it is relatable and transferable to all forms of betrayal trauma. Okay. All right. So when betrayal trauma, um, okay, so betrayal trauma can occur in a single event or over days, weeks, months, and years. Rarely does that happen. Usually there's a repeat of it. The reason for this that can still be betrayal trauma or complex trauma is that of that grooming that Dr. Minwala has talked about, that deceit, the gaslighting, the manipulation, which are all forms of psychological abuse. Okay. When betrayal is repeated, you know, in the family, religious organizations, through intimate partner, cultural, institutional, it often becomes complex trauma. Okay? Research on how those who are marginalized in marginalized populations, for example, an ethnicity or gender or their sexuality, how they identify, are all marginal populations. They often experience, to a greater degree, multiple forms of betrayal trauma. Okay, let's sit with that. And I brought the tea. Brought the tea today. So let's have a sip. The other aspect that is different from PTSD to complex trauma is the power and trust that is in betrayal trauma, which associated them with complex trauma, is that the power and trust dynamics deepen the damage. And remember, I said that complex trauma is on a different level. It's a deeper level of pain and symptoms. Okay. There are overlapping symptoms between PTSD and complex trauma, and those are emotional dysregulation, hypervigilance, dissociation, difficulty with relationships and trust, negative self-concept, and shame. And where shame may come in is in PTSD, singular event, sexual assault by a stranger. We still may say that, well, you know, maybe I let this person on, even though they came out of the blue. Okay. It's our way of our brain um, trying to tell us that something we had control of something, when in actual fact, we had zero control. We were powerless over what somebody else did to us. Okay. And then somatic symptoms, and that's the body storing trauma. So somatic means having to do with our bodies and how our bodies keep trauma. It stays in our cells until it's processed. And then it can go into long-term memory emotionally. And then why the overlap matters for healing. Why is it important that we talk about this overlap? Okay. Because most treatments that deal with trauma are designed for single event trauma, and they often fall short of what is needed in complex trauma. Importance of recognizing the relational and the attachment injuries are often missed when someone is treating trauma patients or clients that as a single event when it's actually betrayal. Okay, that relational aspect is so incredibly important, and the attachment injuries. Okay, the need for safe, consistent therapeutic relationships and body-based healing modules or modalities. So I'm going to talk about a little of those approaches, but I'm going to talk about them in greater depth in future episodes. Okay, so we need to think of phase-based trauma. So when I did my traumatologist certification, it was a triphasic model, and that was stabilization first. So that's your helping you to maintain self-care. That is, coping strategies, relaxation techniques, grounding techniques. And some of those are, yeah, I don't, mindfulness. And some people, I can't meditate. Hey, I can't either. There's lots of things that we can do instead. And if meditation isn't for you, if that is brought up by your therapist, but it isn't for you, let them know it's not for you. Need something else. I will often suggest to my clients journaling. Journaling is a wonderful aspect, but my first question is, do you like to write? Are you a writer? Do you like to write? If the answer is no, I don't even suggest journaling unless they want to do a 1 day check-in with them, one word check-in with themselves on a daily basis. But then they can do it on their phone. They can record it. If they want to write it down, they can, but they don't have to. It's for themselves. I'm not a writer. It's funny because I've developed two courses. One was a 50-hour course in supervision, and then the 12-hour course, and now all the writing for this. But I tell myself I'm not a writer. Writing is not my favorite thing. I love to read. I love to read. And why the podcast is because you might not have known, but I love to talk. Um, but I'm a really good listener as well. Okay. So the need for safe, consistent therapeutic relationships and body-based, triphasic model. Sorry, I just missed where I was there for a moment. Limbic system retraining. And why limbic system? Our limbic system is our emotional system. And that's where trauma is. In our visual memory, in our prefrontal cortex, it can go into long-term things that we experience can go into long-term memory, but in our emotional memory, it stays present in a loop and not in consecutive order. It stays in most impactful order, and it's like it's in a loop in our short-term memory. It does not go into long-term until we process it. And that doesn't mean that we have to talk about in great detail what happened to us. That's not true. Some people need to, and okay, let's talk about it. But some people just, this happened. And in a very short, this happened. We need to go to how it's affecting them now. What messages are they still telling themselves? Are we still telling ourselves from what we experienced? What messages did we hear and what are we telling ourselves now? Limbic based retraining. And again, I'm going to get into that in future. So those are using the emotion and going towards the emotion, as painful as that is, rather than the cognitive. The cognitive is often shut down and we can't access it. So it doesn't make any sense to go to the cognitive because that's where people go, therapy doesn't work for me. No, it was because they were going to the cognitive rather than we've got to get to the heart of the matter. Okay. The cognitive in the second phase of processing is putting a band-aid on an infected wound. And we've got to treat the infection. We've got to treat the infection so the wound can heal. And there'll always be a scar. Why will it always be a scar? Because it happened and we can't make that go away. We don't let it go. We don't cut the ribbon and there God's floating away. We don't let it go. We don't get over it, leave it behind. We have to move through it. We don't go around it. We have to move through it. Okay. So stabilization, then processing, then reintegration. Reintegration is connecting with self. It's learning about self. And that's where the real healing work. We have to do some of that processing to get to go into long-term memory, but that can be done through learning about yourself in a somatic way. Okay. Other ways a therapeutic approach is trauma-informed group support. Okay. Creative and somatic therapies, as I talked about, movement, art, breath work, equine therapy, that's working with horses, dancing. There's all kinds of things that can be done. Okay. So in my healing journey, I had children first because I never thought I was smart enough to go to university. I had children first before I started my undergrad, and then I just did one course at a time as we could afford it. And when I started having a lot of flashbacks and nightmares after watching a movie from my own childhood and teenage stuff, that I went to therapy. And let me tell you, it was kicking and screaming at first. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to address any of it. But after I started to do it, it was like I could breathe. The weight was being lifted from my chest. I could put my shoulders back. I could hold my head up. And I always thought when I was doing my undergrad that I was going to go to teachers college because I loved working with children. I love the innocence and the honesty of children. But I realized in doing my own healing work that I needed to do this work. I needed to help others in a therapeutic way, in counseling. And I feel, in a way, my own body has betrayed me. And I'm going to tear up with the health issues that I have because they're lifelong, which is why I had to retire. I'm managing podcasts I can record in those days that I'm having a good day. And I record maybe sometimes two or three. Sometimes I change my clothes so you think it's a different day. But I've been recording some on and to up ahead because I never know how I'm going to feel tomorrow. And so I need to have rest days. So I'm managing, but there's a feeling of betrayal from my own body. And yet I know, like I talked about the adrenal insufficiency, that's one that is life-threatening and will be lifelong, is that this is my body's way of telling me I went through hell. And so I thank it. As much as I get tears about it, I also thank it because I don't want to die. I have a lot of life left to live. and a lot of helping left to do. And this is the way I can do it. So that complex trauma that I likely had that I was never diagnosed with, PTSD I was diagnosed with, but it's likely complex trauma, is part of my picture, part of my narrative, and part of my healing. And when I can guide a client, they're doing the work. I'm a tiny, tiny, tiny part in their healing journey. When I can guide a client through that stabilization and processing their hurt and their betrayal, and they're reconnecting with self, and you see that growth and that strength, and their heads held up high from coming in and not being able to make eye contact with me to make eye contact with everybody because they know who they are. That is the gift that they give me, the gift and the honor and the privilege to do what I do. It is, I can't describe it. And it makes what's happened to me I just, it worth it, if you will, in a way. I would never wish this on my worst enemy. Not betrayal trauma, not these feelings, not this pain, especially, you know, the pain. My father was an abuser. And I remember my daughter saying after finding out about my husband, um, my daughter saying, "Well, I don't understand why it's affecting you so much, Mom, because you've already lived through this with your father." And I said to her, the difference was I feared my father. I never loved my father. He was someone to stay away from. Whereas my husband, I loved with every ounce of my being. So the second healing journey was twice as long because of that connection, because how much I loved him and trusted him. And that's important to remember. Okay. So I'm going to end it here with takeaways of that complex trauma develops when harm is repeated and prolonged. Um, and betrayal trauma is a major part of that. The next is recognizing the overlap that survivors seek in the right kind of healing. Person doesn't feel right for you, find somebody else. Please, please, please don't settle. Don't settle if it doesn't feel right. And the recovery requires addressing both the betrayal and the long-term relational wounds. Okay. That is so, so important. So again, we're going to do a part 2 of episode 5. And then, and I'm going to do that this week. And so 2 will be added for this week. And then episode 6, which will be next week, is on betrayal trauma blindness and why we sometimes can't see that harm. Okay. So I want to thank you for joining me today on Beneath the Silence. Remember, healing is possible. It's possible. And there's more resources on my website. This 13 Dimensions of Trauma is on my, from Dr. Omar Manwala is on my website. These podcasts are on my website. And the professional training for the 12-hour betrayal trauma course is also, so sandrajoy.ca. And until next time. Please take gentle care of yourself and remember that I see you, I hear you, and I believe you. Until we meet again, thank you.